this video, I imagine the sleep isn't coming easily tonight. Perhaps your mind is busy. Perhaps it simply won't quiet down, no matter how tired you are. You're in exactly the right place. My name is Joe, and this is Quiet In, a channel devoted entirely to helping you fall asleep through the gentle art of ASMR bedtime stories. This particular video is a little bit different from the others you're going to find here. Think of it as a complete introduction to what ASMR actually is, to why bedtime stories work so beautifully for sleep, and then, of course, a story of my own designed to carry you quietly off to sleep. Tonight's story is called A Gentle History of the English Teashop, a gentle journey through centuries of English tea culture that will carry you peacefully into sleep. So, if you'd like to understand what this channel offers, stay with me for the first few minutes. And if you simply want to close your eyes and be read to, that's perfectly alright too. The story will begin in a few minutes, and I'll get you there gently. So let's begin. Let's start with what is ASMR and why does it help you sleep? ASMR stands for Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response. It's rather a clinical sounding name for something that is, in truth, quite a soft and pleasant experience. You may already know the feeling, even if you've never had a word for it, a gentle tingling that begins at the scalp and drifts down through the neck and shoulders. A deep, almost immediate sense of calm, the sensation of being quite suddenly at ease. It tends to be triggered by a very specific, quiet stimulation, a soft voice, someone speaking close to you, the sound of pages turning, slow, deliberate movement, the rustle of fabric, rain on glass, or someone carefully explaining something in low, unhurried tones. Not everyone experiences the physical tingling. Research estimates that it affects perhaps 1 in 3 people, but the deeper relaxation response appears to be far more widespread. Most people who listen to ASMR content report a marked slowing of an anxious thought, a heaviness in the limbs, and a genuine easing towards sleep. It's a form of guided sleep that works through gentle sensory triggers rather than direct instruction. It is, in its most straightforward terms, the sound equivalent of being tucked in. And why the voice matters. The human voice is extraordinarily powerful when it comes to sleep. We are, after all, creatures who were spoken to before we could speak ourselves, long before we understood words, long before we understood tone, pace, warmth. The reassurance carried in a slow, steady voice telling us, without saying it outright, that everything is going to be quite alright. A soft, unhurried voice does something that music and white noise simply cannot. It gives the busy mind something to gently follow, not something demanding, not something that requires thought or response, just a quiet thread of words to hold on to while everything else slowly falls away. When the mind has something simple and pleasant to rest on, it stops reaching for other things that kept it awake. There is a reason the bedtime story has existed in almost every culture, in almost every era of human history. Plain and simple, it just works. A well-chosen story at bedtime can do something special. It occupies just enough of the mind to prevent it from churning through the day's worries, but not so much that it stimulates or excites. It offers gentle images to rest on, a room to inhabit, a pace to follow. The stories you'll find on this channel are designed with that in mind. They're not thrillers, they're not mysteries with urgent resolutions. They are quiet things, descriptive, unhurried, rich in small and pleasant detail. Stories about places you'd like to be, times you'd like to visit. Small, ordinary moments made somehow wonderful, simply by the care with which they're described. They are stories that don't mind at all if you fall asleep before the end. A note before we begin. Tonight's story is one very close to my heart. It's the gentle history of the English teashop. We shall move through the origins, from the very first tea gardens of 18th century London, through the elegant tea rooms of the Victorian era, to the cosy, slightly faded tea shops that still quietly sit on English high streets today. There is nothing urgent about it, nothing that requires your full attention. You are welcome to let the words wash over you, to only notice the parts that catch your interest, and to drift away entirely whenever sleep decides to come. On to the story. A gentle history of the English tea shop. When tea arrived in England sometime in the 1650s, it came quietly, as the best things tend to, carried in the holds of merchant ships from China, traded through the East India Company, and sold at first in coffee houses, where it was regarded as something of a curiosity. The Portuguese princess who married King Charles in 1662 is often credited with introducing tea drinking to the English court, making it fashionable among the nobility. A notice in a London coffee house from 1658 advertised it as, and I am quoting here almost exactly, that excellent and by all physicians approved China drink, called by the Chinese cha, by other nations they, alias tea. It was expensive, it was unusual, and it was, by the standards of the time, deeply fashionable. But tea in those early years was a public thing, a drink of coffee houses, of commerce, of men conducting business over small, bitter cups. Merchants like Thomas Twining, who established his tea business in 1706, began to make tea more accessible to the growing middle classes. The quieter, more domestic life of tea, the pot on the table, the cake on the stand, the chairs pulled close to the fire, they all came later. By the early 18th century, London had developed something rather wonderful. The pleasure garden, Vauxhall Gardens, Marylebone. These were all open-air spaces, elaborate, festive, lit by lanterns on summer evenings, where Londoners of all classes came to walk, to listen to music, and to be seen, and, don't forget, crucially, to drink tea. The tea gardens were among the first places in England where tea was served to women in public. This was something genuinely new. The coffee houses had been, by customs, and sometimes by rule, the exclusive territory of men. But the pleasure gardens were open to everyone, and tea, with all its associations of refinement and gentle sociability, became the drink of choice. Imagine an evening at Vauxhall in 1740 or so. The paths are lit with lamps hung between the trees. Somewhere in the distance an orchestra is playing. Ladies in wide silk skirts walk arm in arm with their companions, and in the sandwiches. Waiters carried trays of bread and butter, thin slices of ham, and pot after pot of freshly brewed tea. It is not so very different in spirit from the teashop of 2 centuries later. The specific pleasure of sitting down somewhere pleasant with a pot of tea and settling the rest of the world gently aside. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, tea moved gradually indoors into the drawing rooms of the middle and upper classes. First of all, where the ritual of afternoon tea, that very British invention, began to take shape. The story, although unverified but pleasantly persistent, is that afternoon tea was the particular habit of Anna, the 7th Duchess of Bedford, around sometime in the 1840s. At that time, it was customary for fashionable households to eat dinner quite late, 8 or 9 in the evening. The gap between a light luncheon and the dinner hour was considerable, and the Duchess, so the story goes, found herself suffering from what she described as a sinking feeling in the late afternoon. Her solution was to have a tray brought to her rooms around 4 o'clock. A pot of tea, some bread and butter, and perhaps a small cake or 2. She found it so agreeable that she began inviting friends to join her, and from that small domestic habit an institution was born. By the 1860s and 1870s, afternoon tea had become one of the central social rituals of respectable English life. The table laid bare with a white cloth, the best china brought out, a tiered stand with sandwiches and scones, the teapot wrapped in its cosy. The careful ritual of pouring, of passing, of quietly sitting together in the middle of the afternoon. The tea shop as a public institution, somewhere you could simply walk in and sit down and be served tea. It is generally considered to have begun with a company called the Aerated Bread Company, or ABC. In 1864, a manageress at one of their London bread shops had the idea of serving tea and light refreshments to customers at the counter, rather than simply selling them bread to take away. It was a modest experiment, but the response was immediate. People wanted it, particularly women who found themselves in the city, shopping, working, or simply moving through the world, with nowhere quiet and respectable to stop and rest and take some refreshment. The existing public houses were not suitable. By the standards of the day, they were loud, they smelled of beer, and they were emphatically male. But a tea shop, quiet, clean, well lit, serving tea and sandwiches and a slice of cake, was an entirely different proposition altogether. The Aerated Bread Company opened more, and then more still, and by the end of the Victorian era, they had around 100 tea shops. Their great rival, the Lyons Tea Company, began their own chain in 1894. The Lyons Corner houses, grand, marble-floored, softly lit establishments in the most prominent locations in London. They became genuine landmarks of city life. The uniformed waitresses, known as nippies, became cultural icons in their own right, famous for their efficiency and cheerful service. At their peak, Lyons served something in the region of around 300,000 customers every single day. Some places say it was a lot more than that. Tea had become, quite definitely, the drink of ordinary English life. If there is a golden age of the English tea shop, most people who write about such things place it in the years between the 2 world wars, the 1920s and the 1930s. This was the period when tea shop seems to exist on almost every high street in England, in cities, market towns, seaside resorts, cathedral cities and quiet country villages. They were not grand places. Most of them, they were small. They had low ceilings and mismatched china and tables covered with checked or floral cloths. A glass case near the counter held the day's cakes. Victoria sponges perhaps, or rock cakes, or a seed cake of that kind that had been baked in English kitchens for 200 years. The menu was short and entirely familiar. Pot of tea for two, toasted tea cakes, scones. Let the scone or scone debate start, with clotted cream and jam, and in Devon and Cornwall, a fierce local argument about which should be applied first starts. There were places that had no particular ambition beyond the provision of a quiet hour, a place to sit down, to warm your hands around a cup, to watch the street outside through a low window with slightly uneven glass, to speak with a companion, or to say nothing at all, and simply be somewhere unhurried for a little while. The great teashop chains mostly faded in the second half of the 20th century. Lyons served its last customer in 1981. The aerated brain company by that point had long since gone. The habits of English life changed. People ate later, worked longer, moved faster, expected different things, but the tea shop itself did not disappear. It simply became quieter, more particular, more itself. If you know where to look, and most English people do, you can still find them. In the back streets of a cathedral city like Lincoln, down a short flight of steps, a small room with 4 tables, a special board written in chalk. The owner will bring your tea in a proper pot with a small jug of milk and a paper dolly under the cup. There'll be a slice of something homemade under a glass dome on the counter. Or it could be by the harbour in a Cornish fishing village like Padstow. The windows salt hazed, the tablecloths slightly damp from the air, a fire in the corner, even in June, cream tea served on mismatched plates, the distinctly Cornish tradition of scones with clotted cream and strawberry jam. Or in a garden centre, unexpectedly, a long, low conservatory room full of wicker chairs and the smell of compost and warm air, where elderly couples sit for a very long time over a pot of Yorkshire tea and 2 slices of fruit cake. These places persist because something in us still wants what they offer, not efficiency, not novelty, and not the particular pleasure of the new. Simply, and this is quite enough, a quiet place to stop. I'd like to leave you, if I can, with a small imagine scene. It's a Thursday afternoon in October, sometime in the late 1930s. A tea shop somewhere in a market town in the English Midlands. The high street outside is quiet. A few shoppers, a delivery bicycle propped against a wall, the distant sound of a clock tower making the half hour. Inside the tea shop it's warm. A fire has been laid in the small hearth at the far end of the room, and its light shifts softly across the low ceiling. The tables are covered in cream-coloured cloths with a thin blue border. Each one holds a small vase with a single spray of dry flowers, lavender perhaps, or something gathered from a garden in September. There are perhaps half a dozen people in the room, 2 women at the window table deep in conversation that has been going on since before the tea arrived, an older man alone near the fire reading a newspaper he has already read twice, simply because the fire is pleasant and there is nowhere else he needs to be. A young couple near the door, not speaking much, both of them looking out at the street with a contentment that doesn't require words. A woman in a white apron comes from the back room carrying a fresh pot. She sets it down without being asked, adjusts the cosy, and returns as quietly as she came. The fire settles. Somewhere a cup is placed gently back in its saucer. The rain, which has been threatening since noon, begins at last. A soft and steady sound against the window, and nothing for a while is required of anyone at all, including you. That's all for tonight. I hope it was enough to carry you somewhere quiet. If you're still awake, don't worry. Simply close your eyes, let your breathing slow down, and allow everything to settle. You don't need